Hello, I am Ajuri Ogena, and I'm part of the team at the Center for Research and Education on Violence Against Women and Children. On behalf of the Learning Network and Knowledge Hub, we welcome you to our webinar, Navigating Trauma-Informed Embodiment Practices with Survivors and Those Supporting Survivors of Gender-Based Violence. I want to acknowledge our work is located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lepantwark, and Chon-Ong-Twang nations. These lands are connected with the London Township and Silver Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampanoag. We make this acknowledgement to counter the doctrine of discovery and recognize Indigenous land and sovereignty. We also recognize that many Black people were violently displaced to Canada through settler colonialism and slavery. We will continue to work collaboratively with communities to challenge colonialism, anti-Black racism, and further forms of oppression that remain pervasive in Canada and that result in disproportionate impacts of gender-based violence on oppressed communities. We wish to express gratitude to Mother Earth for the resources we're using and to honor all the First Nation, Métis, and Inuit people who have been living on this land for at least 15,000 years. So today, we're happy to be joined by Nicole Brown-Faulkner and Margot Feldman. You will find their full bios in the link we're sharing in the chat. Margot and Nicole both dedicate their work to promoting mental health and disability justice, with a specific focus on supporting survivors of trauma and based violence through creative and therapeutic practices. We will begin with a grounding exercise that will be led by Nicole. This will be followed by a curated presentation addressing key questions for both of our presenters, and we will open the floor to the audience for a Q&A session following the presentation. So welcome and join me in welcoming our presenters, and I give the floor to Nicole to start with the grounding exercise. Thank you.
Thank you. So grounding actually might be a way that we give our bodies permission to allow it to be here. So for those interested, feel free to take your right hand and you get to place it over your heart. Now, if that's comfortable for you, another option too is to place both hands on the body. So one over the heart, and then you can use your left hand over the belly. Now, when I say heart, we notice the hand over the heart. And when I say belly, we only notice the hand over the belly. Heart. Belly. You might need to press into the belly a little bit more to only notice the hand over the belly. Heart. Both heart and belly at the same time. See if you can notice the touch or the sensation under the hand of both the heart and the belly at the same time. Now you're welcome to stay here for those who choose. You might begin to rub down the arms. So you might cross over. They say cortisol somatically pulls from the shoulder to the elbow. So we just give our bodies a little bit of a rub or hug or embrace. And we just kind of sweep our hands down the arm, out through the hands. Yeah. Now, grounding is a technique that we use for embodiment. As you do this, again, as I mentioned, to allow our bodies to be here now. It also helps our body get rid of the overwhelm that inhibits our bodies from recovering. Giving our bodies permission to turn inward and turn our attention to our emotions. We're going to add breath for the last 3. You might rub from the shoulder to the elbow, as you might be seeing me doing now, and sweeping it out through the hand with a. Feel free to flow with your own bodies. And then we just hold our bodies for 6. You can embrace your body in any way. You can do skin to skin, rest the chin on the hand or the shoulder for 5. And maybe for 1. If you're ready, our bodies do love slow movement. You might begin to explore a slower movement than you'd like, lifting your body up and out of your own embrace if you are hugging your bodies, and then just responding to the body. You might notice your body like rolling out through joints. They say we hold blockage emotionally in the joints of the body. Just give it a roll in any way as you bring your attention back to the screen. These lovely cats on the screen, and back to our host.
Thank you, Nicole, for grounding us. Thank you. So we're going to go right into our engagement in your presentation. So this first question is for both of you, Margot and Nicole. How do you approach trauma-informed and embodiment work, the work of connecting mind and body? What kinds of practices fall under this work in the communities you serve, and how are they linked to the broader work of addressing GBV?
All right, I'm just going to jump in. I really appreciate how this question really prompts us to like connect the mind and the body, because it really wasn't until the 17th century that we began to see the mind and body as separate entities. And I could like nerd out on the philosophy here behind this, but I'm going to digress, because what I really want to highlight is that this like mind-body dualism, as it's called, has really caused major problems in how we understand and treat trauma. So here's a definition of trauma that I love to work with. Oh, sorry, go back 1 slide. Thank you. So trauma is the body's protective response to an event or series of events that it perceives as potentially dangerous. This perception may be accurate, inaccurate, or entirely imaginary. And it really doesn't matter, because the response that our body is having in that moment is just one of danger. Trauma is our body's response to traumatic events that we weren't able to process at the time that they occurred. And this is often the case because we're actually just lacking the supports that we need to process the traumatic event. And so what happens is trauma takes up residence in our bodies. And this is not a metaphor. When our body represses trauma, it lives in the body. So some examples of this include disordered sleep due to an overactive fight or flight response, neck or back pain from being in a state of rigidity due to that hypervigilance of bracing for the next danger or threat. And trauma quite literally shapes our bodies. So advances in neurophysiology show that trauma produces an increase in stress hormone activity and recalibrates the brain's alarm system, or what's known as the amygdala, to be constantly activated. The alarm system is just on a constant on setting. When our nervous system is in a constant state of stress, our body will compensate by slowing down bodily functions that are deemed non-essential, which includes digestion, bowel mobility, and detoxification. In his national bestseller, When the Body Says No, trauma specialist Gabor Mate shares a list of other diagnoses that can emerge from untreated trauma. This includes multiple sclerosis, Crohn's disease, autoimmune disorders, fibromyalgia, endometriosis, and ALS. I am here as a survivor of gender-based violence, which has led to complex trauma, and I also live with fibromyalgia, and this is not a coincidence. My approach to addressing and healing from trauma is very much rooted in the body, and in practice, for me, this has looked like somatic therapy with a particular focus on EMDR and parts work. So for folks who aren't familiar, I want to offer a definition of somatics. This is our next slide. There we go. And in particular, generative somatics, which I'll get into in a second. So somatics, really, to get word nerdy here, the word somatics comes from the Greek root soma, which means the living organism in its wholeness. With a somatic approach to trauma, we recognize that this mind-body divide is a fiction. We have body minds, a term that comes from Margaret Price's work. So this is why at a certain point, talk therapy isn't enough when it comes to healing from trauma. We need to connect with our bodies because, to borrow the phrase of another famous book on this topic, our body indeed keeps the score. In the work that I do as a trauma educator, I draw specifically from the lineage of generative somatics, which is a politicized form of somatics that acknowledges that trauma comes from and is exacerbated by social, cultural, political, and ecological forces, which have been shaped by systemic oppression, including but not limited to racism, homophobia, transphobia, misogyny, capitalism, and imperialism. So here on the slide, we have this sites of shaping, sites of change model that generative somatics uses. And so here we're not just looking at the individual, which we see kind of in that white circle, because gender-based violence is caused by misogyny, it's caused by homophobia, transphobia, and other forms of systemic oppression. There's only so much work we can do to heal from sexual trauma if the world that I'm living in is one that perpetuates rape culture and patriarchal dominance. So here we want to look at, institutions that uphold misogyny, homophobia, transphobia, and other forms of systemic oppression. We want to look at the social norms and historical forces. We want to look at how that takes shape in our communities. And so using this sites of shaping, sites of change model, we can see how systemic oppression operates on all levels of relationality. So, for me growing up, the ways in which as someone who is gendered a girl, that meant that I was expected to do, all of this like house labor. It also meant that my emotions were not seen as valid, that they were coded as irrational. And so, already there, when we think about violence as something that happens on a scale, those microaggressions that we experience in our day-to-day life, those both inform and are informed by larger systems. You know, what kinds of norms exist in our communities that we're a part of, how institutions still will pay women, folks who are gendered as women, less than folks who are gendered as men, thereby perpetuating the belief that women should be treated as lesser than. And so we can kind of keep going here to see the ways in which gender-based violence isn't isolated, but it is in fact very part of the social fabric that we are existing in. I'm gonna pause there.
Thank you, Margot. And Nicole is going to respond to the same question.
Yes, thank you, Margot. I always like listening, and for those who know me, I do lots of educating, so I always listen to like weave education together, especially when I'm working with people such as you, Margot. So I'm gonna just link in, if I can, around protective response. Thank you for that. Actually, I should probably go to my slides, right? Okay. So I like thank you for that. The trauma, explaining trauma as a protective response, and also allows me to bring in the meaning of embodiment. So trauma is how helplessness got trapped in our nervous system. And somatic in Latin means like the whole organism, which is the whole body. And viscerally, we have feelings on our bodies, like emotions. Like, for example, before speaking, my heart might flutter a little bit. And so it might feel scared. But what I know about emotions is that that visceral information that goes up to my brain, it gives it a feeling name, but all feelings are memories. So my body might come in saying, this is vulnerable. Vulnerability once before to me meant punishment. So I have to unlearn certain aspects of this helplessness and how it got trapped in my nervous system. So I get to do this work in so many different ways. I get to bring it in as an embodiment coach. I get to bring it in as a registered psychotherapist, trauma consulting, and all these things. And my work culture is to embody a culture of critical self-reflection, like allowing individuals who create communities and systems to turn inward, one person at a time. Some people say this is radical, and I say, but is it? We all, you know, especially if we lead this work, it may be important to have a sense of curiosity in our own responses, okay? So embodiment means a returning back to the body to feel internally safe. If that flutter in my heart made me leave my body and now I have patterns of behaviors, that's what happens with trauma. We have patterns of behaviors that get characterized as our personality, but there are a plethora of adaptation strategies. That a lot of people might be doing this work and working with our communities from these patterns of behavior. And so it could be harmful unintentionally. And I like to run training and do these types of workshops so that we can actually honor the lived experience inside of our bodies and actually have an ongoing commitment to ourselves to recognize our place, our power, our privileges in the system in which I work in, you work in. When I use power in this reference, it's how we protect our trauma responses. And we'll talk about that later, but all responses in the body are based out of a fear response. But if you open it up, it has our feelings of shame, hurt, sadness, anger, and these types of things, okay? So when I say power, it's the behaviors we have that are kind of, what do we call it? Like nestled around all of our responses in our bodies. And so embodiment says we explore that, we open it up so that we can learn this feeling, this tolerance in the body, okay? So how I bring that in is we're always embodying learning. I call it the reboot. So people's thoughts and perspectives are through a lens of helplessness. It's just a human phenomena. Welcome to being human. We came here as such. So we tend to, this is unconscious or subconscious, I understand this, but we tend to see through a lens of helplessness. And this fear okay? And it depends on what communities you work with, but I have seen lots of gender violence and this hate, projected hate into communities. But fear is hate, and what we once fear, we hate. And that's why individuals need to be responsible for what's going on in their bodies. But it overshadows people's disconnection to the self. And so when we do training, when we use a cognitive mind frame to explore embodied issues like this, when it comes to mental health care or gender-based violence related issues, we tend to say it's kind of counterproductive. So, you know, I'll say that for that, being educator, okay? Just give it food for thought. I'm known for that. I don't know if, but was who, I don't know where, I can't see everyone, but I'm known for giving lots of food for thought. So people walk away kind of like, thought conscious, like, what was that? And that's called embodiment when we do that. So you know that, okay? All right. Now, that was Marco's fault because that was such a great way to come in. So I just thought to connect on that. So thank you. Okay. Now, responsive care and impact awareness probably is what you started to hear me talk about. I feel this, the more awareness we build, the less impact due to the connection with our emotional brain, okay? Where our feelings are connected to the self-awareness part of the brain. So if you understand trauma, I call it a trauma brain, the way it's wired, the limbic system to the front part of the brain, when there's trauma, it kind of recircuits, and we can't really connect to the learning if our body's in a vigilance or in a reactivity, okay? So a couple things just to think about in this slide, okay? Is the reactivity, when is my body reacting? When is it responding? Okay. When is my body caring for the clients I work with or the community I work with? And when is it carrying? Okay. When am I absorbing? When am I absorbing what's going on, or when am I observing? Now, these are ways to track what I call responsive care. And this is another example of how all of our bodies do this. We protect ourselves through our helplessness, okay? And so what I like to do is I like to bring in, I really do feel this, that the root causes is really important when we work with communities, okay? And so I like to give lots of education so that we can address the interconnectedness of the mind and the body. So here, if I can, let me see if I can switch my slide. More visual, okay? But here's a slide, for example. Okay, let's use a female identifying body, okay? Black female identifying body we're working with. Now, it is for us to hold. How has my body been socialized to see value in other races, genders, demographics? Okay, so in this slide, I was working with the University of Waterloo, and just to brainstorm some things, lots of things came in, like promiscuity, the projection of promiscuity on Black female bodies, the numbers of fathers that baby fathers, these are stereotypes, by the way. I can go on and on. My point is that if you sat with the history to understand this, the impact of slavery that it had, is that by the time children were by the age of 13, they may have already bared 1 or 2 children by then. It was part of the of survival. Their bodies were parts of trades, like sex trades, and a part of the lifestyle. By 20, a child could have had already by 8 just to gain her freedom or their freedom, okay? Now, I say all this and introduce that to bring something to notion, which is a couple things, okay? The circle of intersectionality and the complexity of it, okay? Now working with, for example, a Black girl who now is an adult in a queer body or trans body or whatever, this history lives in the epigenetics, in the DNA of this person. Now, I'm going to say that trauma may be one of the most avoided, ignored, misunderstood, underrated cause of human suffering. Can we get a yes? Okay, the word itself has been picked up in the pop culture. I don't know, and it's actually lost its substance. Like it's used so loosely. I don't know, but what I'll say is that we can have entire groups, like it's called historical trauma, but we can have a multi-generational trauma experienced by a specific cultural group or racial ethnic group, and it is related to that major event that oppresses a particular group of people because of their status. Okay, so slavery, migration, all these things may be part of that. And we've mischaracterized this as their identity when it is a plethora of survival responses without an opportunity to be understood, to be seen, to be heard. Okay, so that's how I embody the learnings to kind of bring into our awareness the impact of responsive care, which is what I call it. Hopefully I get to talk on a little bit more later, and impact awareness. And I'm going to peel that back so that us who are clinicians or frontline can understand it from the lens of taking care of community. This is more history. So I'm just going to pause, like, just to finish reading a little bit more of the history. For those who choose. I'll just give another 10 seconds. Okay. So resistance training is what I've become known for, is the very thing, which is we can't really make any changes until we realize how it affects us. And so the turning inward, this embodied way of doing training before the cognitive way, like how to care, instructionally telling people how to care, do this, do that, may not work because we're not connected to our feeling and our feeling body. So if we're not connected to ourselves, how do we generally non-performatively connect to others? Okay, so becoming aware, we'll talk about, actually I'm going to talk about this later. Again, I'm going to keep blaming this on Margot if that's okay, because I kind of went ahead of myself, but I want to bring this back if I can, talking about intersectionality and all that. So what I'm doing here is I'm weaving this demonstration of from slavery or a Black girl's body and how it's been objectified through the intersectionality learning and understanding trauma and the impacts of trauma and how it can be mischaracterized. I'm going to pause there. I'm actually stopping myself. One more thing, if I can, actually. Okay, this is it. Okay. Also, when I talk about the history of objectification and the history of not being allowed to feel history, okay, that's what I'm talking about here. If you are working with Black communities, what I'm saying here is that there's a history that you're working with in front of you in that person's body that has been conditioned on survival mode to not be able to feel. Okay? And I'll say we, because I'm in a Black body, as you can see, but we're known for our sadness, you know this? But it looks like anger. That's another thing. Survival mode, anger is repressed sadness. Can I share that? It's repressed sadness, okay? And when I work with anyone with, yes, internalization of oppression, I just saw a note pop up. That was brilliant. That's someone's comment probably, but it's exactly what I'm talking about. But when I work with anyone who I'm working with anger work, I ask two questions. I ask, what scares you or what is making you sad in this moment? But if our bodies have been mischaracterized because we're still in a survival response and we're in a system that wasn't really designed for us, this can get mischaracterized and not humanized in the person. Okay? So I said that was all I'd say. So that's going to be it. Okay. I will
Thank you, Nick.
send it. Thank you. Over to you, Richard.
Thank you, Nicole, and for the context. So the next question is yours. Trauma-informed and embodiment work can sometimes do more harm than good, especially when we consider certain communities and individuals who are facing chronic systemic barriers and intersectional harms. such as poverty, racism, exclusion. You've mentioned some of them already. So, how do you navigate this reality in your work and practice to address these intersectional and systemic challenges among historically ignored communities?
Okay, wonderful. So, okay, thank you. So that I went ahead of myself too. Okay, because I knew, yeah, I get excited about it, educating about it. So this is going to go right to our intersectionality. Now, intersectionality, oh, I can go into this in so many ways, but I'm going to say that when we are able to identify with our privilege and where it intersects in these demographics, okay, with someone else's oppression, we will find an opportunity to make real change. If we take the time at these intersections, so where fear and power collide, so when I say fear, like how we protect ourselves, it becomes power. And when I say that, it is how we take care of the feeling on our body. If we feel guilty, if we feel shame, if we feel hurt, these are what I'm talking about when I talk about fear. It is a construct, okay? And we protect it by behaviors. Now, if we can open that up and work with that, that's what I'm talking about here. We can really make some real changes. And again, this is an introspective thought, okay? Now, intersectionality, people say, what is it? Exactly. There are lots of terminology for it. It was created by Kimberly Crenshaw, I believe. So don't mark my words. And if anyone knows, write it, please, in the chat. Okay. Now, intersectionality. Through intersectionality, we are able to understand complex solidarities and see how people's identities shape their experiences in their life based on relationship to power. Okay, meaning. So I'm embodying what this means to see, okay, how different forms of discrimination interact and exacerbates inequality. Does that make sense? Now, there it is again, okay? When we identify with our privilege and where it intersects with someone else's oppression, we will find an opportunity to make real change. As Malu from the book, So You Want to Talk About Race, for anyone interested to explore that, gender-based violence trainings may be more to do with connecting to the embodiment proxies. Do you know that? And a deep willingness to be uncomfortable, embodying questions like this in training spaces. What do you feel? And letting people answer this as a collective too, because our work has a core parts of it to do with advocacy. So I bring the voices, this is called equity to me, to spaces. So I ask these difficult questions in board meetings and where powers that be, and allow people to wrestle with it. It allows them to be more embodied, less and less performative, right? Because we got to go, it's called resistance training, okay? Towards what we don't really want to talk about and do so that we can actually make change, okay? But I'll ask, what do you feel about the invisibility of racialized bodies or the hypervisibility on trans bodies? Okay. How do we do gender, or how do we undo gender? This was from an article, and we can send this out after, landmark article. Was there like a research article? But anyway, the title of it. But for this year, I always feel it may be imperative to kind of term things like oppression, what it is. Oppression is a feeling of helplessness, okay, or unheard in a system, okay? We ask, where are individuals and communities feeling helpless? Where are they feeling historically unheard, and addressing it? Equity is really interesting because it might, how it's being termed out there, but it might be for how do I say it? Might be spaces for voices to tell systems and places of power what they need and have their needs met or heard. Okay, we have to recognize the oppression part, and we have to bring voices to outcome part. right? That's the real embodiment of equity, diversity, inclusion, right? I like to just make reference to systemic helplessness. It's like, it's trauma, right? Bring our bodies into a place where we can't really escape from, but we need to go in there to get the help, to get the money, to get the housing, and those types of things. Institutional helplessness is umbrellaed right with that, because there's a hierarchy in there and a powerlessness. Anytime you see things like that, we're talking about trauma. Now, systemic change, to wrap this up, Nicole, is the change that transform how the whole system functions. Okay? Really? I'll leave that for you all to read, because if I keep talking, I'll keep educating. Okay, so hopefully that answers that question. I probably went away from that. I talked about that. What makes you uncomfortable? These are the questions that I go in to do any type of training, so that we can actually do the resistance training. And also the impact awareness part, I feel, is very important. Margot, that's you. Okay. Yeah, the impact awareness, because what we're not connected to, we're projecting, and we're making people that we work with an object, they say, of our comfort. So I feel this question is going to come. So I'm going to leave it to Margot and see if they talk a little bit more about that, so I can talk about impact awareness. What do you think, Margot?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely gonna come up. All right.
Thank you, Nicole. Love the collaboration there. So question is for you, Margot. In your work developing educational digital resources, what are the key messages and highlights that you aim to share with the public about embodiment and trauma-informed practices? How can the digital aspect of this work challenge the reality that this work is not always available and accessible across communities?
Great. Thank you. Yeah, I just want to honor just the magic of the fact that Nicole and I created our slides totally separately, and just like the ways that we are overlapping, is such magic to me. So, one of really like my main goals in the work that I do is to depathologize trauma, which is what we've already been talking about. And so when I use the term pathologize, what I'm referring to is the way in which we have been taught to view trauma as a flaw, a disorder, a sign of abnormality. And so as we've already discussed, trauma really is our body's response to events that were too much, too fast, too soon. And I also really want to depathologize all of our feelings, because anger is something that so many of us have been taught to repress. And, we also experience a lot of shame, and shame, is really just another survival response. And really learning that all of our feelings are these wise teachers. I really do believe that what we've called our symptoms, are actual adaptive survival resources that our brain developed to help us navigate living in the world with trauma. So as an example, as a teenager, I used substances on a daily basis as a way to escape all of my unprocessed and ongoing trauma. And as a teen, this really was one of the only tools that I had access to. I also think that dissociation is another truly brilliant adaptive survival tool, to get us out of just how hard it is to live in a body with trauma, but also in a world where trauma is ongoing. So one of the ways that I promote this reframing of trauma and its symptoms is through the memes that I make on Instagram via my handle softcore trauma or softcore_trauma. I really want to bring softness and humor and compassion to how we approach trauma. And I think the piece around humor in particular has been really important to me, and is also not everyone's cup of tea, because of course trauma and gender-based violence, like these are such like serious topics. And I have found so much healing through being able to look at my trauma responses, the moments that my trauma brain is really trying to protect me, but like as the adult human that I am now, it's kind of missing the mark. And being able to like laugh about that actually really opens up the door to getting softer with myself and having compassion for how I approach my trauma. And this to me feels in direct opposition to a pathologizing approach in which we're taught to see our trauma responses as our failure to be quote unquote resilient. And I have a whole bunch of issues with that term that we could talk about in the Q&A if folks want to dive deeper. I also just really want to normalize how prevalent trauma is. And in the comments to my memes, you just see so many people sharing about how the post I made resonated with them, reflected their experience, helped them feel less seen. And so, you know, these are some examples of memes from my page. I am known for a series that I do called The Traumatized Urge. So here, the traumatized urge to change your aesthetic instead of feeling your feelings. And again, I say this, and I pair the text with images that are either funny or soft or some combination to really drive home that like we don't need to judge ourselves for this. I also have another series about the healing urge, so the healing urge to cultivate relationships where I feel safe and happy and can grow. Because I think, our brains do have this, like, we're hardwired to look for the negative, our sweet negativity bias, which helps keep us safe. And I think it can be really hard to recognize our own healing and growth, often because it happens in like small increments over time. So I also feel it's really important for me to help flag, like, here are some things to look for that you can celebrate in your own healing practice. So those are just some examples there. Some other memes that I've made are really, and again, Nicole and I have just been really vibing on this together. Being trauma informed also means that we must take systemic oppression into account. Trauma is not just caused by a singular event. Trauma is caused by chronic, ongoing traumatic conditions, by ongoing threats to our safety, belonging, and dignity. So here's where I'm inviting folks also to get a little uncomfortable. Because, for me, trauma is a political issue. I can't talk about trauma without talking about politics. And, often when I make posts like this, I get comments of like, oh, why does everything have to be political? And people being, made uncomfortable by this statement that I'm making. Because when we have to acknowledge that trauma is political, and I do believe that this is like something that, the DSM and these sort of like Bibles of diagnoses are very resistant to doing. Because if we have to acknowledge that trauma is political, then we have to change systems. And the powers that be do not want us to change systems, because then they might not be in power. So I also really want to address the ways that it is so hard to access trauma-informed therapy. So you can see this meme in the middle at the bottom, using the painting Christina's World, and we have me as Christina, and the field, the distance between me and the house, the lack of trauma-informed mental health professionals, and my desire, to commit myself to my healing being the houses that I'm trying to make my way towards. It is inaccessible because so many therapists or mental health professionals are not trauma informed. It's inaccessible because of insurance. And I'm now living in the US where that's even more complicated than it was living in Canada. It is also increasingly difficult to find therapists who represent your lived experiences. So finding, a BIPOC trauma-informed therapist who is covered by your insurance. For me, finding someone who is queer, trans, neurodivergent, someone who also thinks about politics. There are all of these access barriers because yes, I'm seeing, therapy is so expensive. And one of my, I guess, true callings in this world is to make knowledge that is inaccessible accessible. I'm seeing Kaylee, this great comment. Some therapists do not frame trauma responses as actual forms of resistance to political, structural, historical oppression, violence, etc. Yes. Yes. So as an educator, I really got to spend my PhD reading about trauma and chronic illness. I also had access to therapy through my health benefits. Not only do the majority of humans not have time to read all of the books about trauma, they're unable to access trauma-informed therapy. And so for me, social media and memes in particular is my intervention, my way of trying to make trauma healing accessible. Another resource that I've developed in this vein is a Discord server, the softcore trauma community, because social media also gives people access to others who share their lived experiences, access that they might not have with humans in their real life because of their social location, because of, just where they live in the world, because it is still seen, despite how much more we're talking about trauma now, that conversation is still happening within limited groups of people. So this is the Discord server that I created for those who follow me. And there's, examples on both the left and the right of some of the different channels, or different, kind of little rooms that people can join to talk about different topics that impact them. There's also a peer support channel and one for resources because I really believe that we all have collective knowledge to share. I really work to try to challenge this idea that I am the teacher, educator, with the only one who holds knowledge. That's just not true. And so this is really also a peer support space. And then there are also channels based on affinity groups as well as locations. And so in this way, folks who wouldn't otherwise have community offline can come to a place where they can connect with others online. And I'm seeing a question, how can we join the Discord server? It is through my Patreon. There will be a link to that at the end. It starts out as little as $1 a month, but it is incredibly important for me that money is never an access barrier. And so I do share with folks on the Patreon page, if you cannot afford the $1 tier, to just email me. There are a bunch of folks in the server who have done that. And if their financial situation changes at some point and they're able to pay a monthly subscription rate, great. And if they're not, they're just continue to be welcome in that space. And Adriana, I love your question. And I'm wondering if you can put it in the Q&A because I would love to answer that question when there is time for that. So yeah, there we go.
Thank you, Margot. So Nicole, and just to you, Margot, as well. Just wanting us to stick to the time because it's exciting, and we definitely want you to engage with all the questions. We have about two more after this. Okay, so Nicole, this is yours. Based on your experience as founder and CEO of Wounds to Wings and offering trauma-informed services in the community, how would you like to see this type of work integrated into the mainstream GBV sector?
Okay. So we have to stick to time. So I'm going to time myself 4 minutes, right? How much time? Okay.
5 minutes.
5 minutes. Okay, I can do it. Margot, thank you. I love the community and the right brain stuff. It is the core of healing. Anything right brain, and you can look that up after, is like the core of healing. Trauma can be, and trauma work and healing can look so serious. And the biochemical opposite of trauma is play. So I found Margot by accident, and now we're here, like online. I didn't know I'd ever meet Margot. So thank you for that. And the community work, I can't even begin around that for more accessible therapy, which is being able to feel safe with other people is probably the single most important aspect of mental health. Feeling safe and connected. So your patron, like all the things. Okay, I'm done. That's a minute. Now I have about 4. Okay, thank you. Now, how do I want to see this type of work integrated? I would love for it to be integrated through what I call trauma responsive training. There's trauma-informed training. I came through this as a clinician and all the schooling I have, okay? I get this, but being trauma-informed and trauma-aware may not be useful as much because it is how to care. Now, trauma-responsive care attaches our behavior and how we interact with our helplessness. Okay. And it brings in trauma-informed care, it brings in trauma awareness, it brings in trauma sensitive. These constructs means that more people than not that you're going to serve or see in a room will have trauma than not, and how to relate to it, right? Now, okay, but what about trauma responsive care? How does my behavior interact with the helplessness in the room? How does it interact with the oppression in the room? So what trauma responsive means is we learn to respond to our earlier life experiences in order to stay safe with people in situations and during events. And that's called, by default, a learned helplessness that's trapped in our nervous system. Well, what we do then, you've heard this between Margot and I about these adaptive survival strategies that we have. Well, that's how we control the helplessness on our bodies. Okay, so we have lots of behaviors. They can come in at any of the 5 trauma responses: fight, flight, freeze, submit, attach. The 2 we hardly speak a lot about, but they're actually, we can't talk about it. Come to my training, I'll talk more about it. But these 5 responses have behaviors. It looks like certain things. I can speak for submit. It's attached to the shame. There's something fundamentally wrong with who I am. Shame. Okay, it allows us to stay smaller and have behaviors around being smaller. So as a child, people thought I was shy. I'm not shy, obviously. That was a behavior learned in order to stay safe or respond to people, okay, through developmental trauma, you see? Now, this can also look like many different things, like people pleasing, micromanaging, being a workaholic, avoidance. Now, as I use, and anyone working with GBV survivors or anyone in the community, our body is the tool for the work. Do we agree? We use our body. This is an instrument for the work. I walk in and I represent every psychotherapist in Ontario because I'm part of CRPO. But so if someone had a bad experience, guess what's going to be projected on me? The better I represent it, because my body is an instrument to do the work. So the work, I have a sense of responsibility to how I show up in my work. Now, impact awareness is what we do through the training. As we start to embody the learnings, we start to see where this shows up for us. Being overprotective or overprotecting the clients we serve or community, fixing, oversharing, over-identifying, feeling stuck, or going silent. all of what I shared through trauma responsive and the control and these 5 trauma responses show up like this. This is what it looks like. Okay. And so our work is to return to the root of that so that it's not projected onto the clients, patients, community, people we serve. So we have a sense of responsibility for our own story in our bodies, okay? So that we can hold space for others. And this is what I talk about or explain in visible power dynamic. It doesn't make me a good or bad person. It's just a human phenomena, okay? So projections is in the behavior, okay? The more healing work and internal journey we do, the more self-observant and self-aware we become of our own responses and reactivity. When am I reacting? When am I responding? When am I carrying? When am I caring? When am I absorbing? When am I observing? Okay. These will know when you're in a trauma response, like a reactivity, or when you're literally holding space. Okay. Okay. That's what I'll say for that. In other words, what we are not connected to, we try to control through our fear responses. And if I could run trauma training everywhere, I would. And this particular type of embodiment training to us that lead the work. Okay. The internal work to the impact to the agency, individuals create systems. Systems don't create systems. Okay. And I feel this, Margaret was sharing this, individuals create systems. So individuals have a sense of responsibility to their own story and their own healing journey. So we're not projecting and mirroring trauma back into communities and the people that we are serving. This also, just moves us away from the performative work. If we're really talking about decentering conversations, we are learning to co-regulate together. It means getting uncomfortable together to work through what that uncomfortable thing is. So there's less power, like how we're trying to control not feeling smaller or embarrassed, which is our shame, right? We need more spaces like that so that we can reproduce these patterns that are etched in the system from individuals staying together in a fix-it mode, okay? So we call this performative care versus decentering and co-regulating together. My food for thought. I'm going to pause so you read this all, okay? There's about 30 seconds just for you to read this. That's all we're asking, okay? In spaces that work with gender-based violence, okay? So we're asking so that we can enhance our communication, our conflict management, our problem-solving skills, okay? These dynamics can literally shift harmful gender and social norms that underlie these types of gender-based violence. I quite like this one though, but it's, okay, I feel like Margot. But this, yeah, it says, so the truth is the more I bypass my own feeling, the less understanding I'll have for yours. Yeah. Okay, so we go inward, we do our deeper work. Okay, there we go.
Thank you, Nicole, Margot, the final one.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Okay. Based on your experience in mobilizing knowledge around trauma and the body and creating digital resources, how could digital educational tools be integrated in the everyday work of addressing GBV in our sector?
Yeah, my answer for this one will be pretty quick. I don't even have slides, but one of the things that I hear from folks all the time, which still like continually blows my mind, is that they talked about my memes in therapy sessions or that their therapist sent them one of my memes. And I just really love the idea that memes can be conversation starters. That they can be an entry point, an easy way into a topic. I know folks who also have used my memes as journaling prompts, which is really cool. There's also something about the way that memes can be an equalizer, kind of like a little nod that says, I see you. In terms of addressing gender-based violence, digital tools like memes can be an easy access point for folks to connect with resources and tools. Often at the end of like a slide deck of mine, I show, different resources that I've created that folks can buy or get for free or engage with. So I do also use memes as a way to promote, because the Instagram algorithm does not want folks to promote things that are going to take them off of the platform. So many of us have found little sneaky ways around that. With topics as heavy as trauma and gender-based violence, the digestible meme format really can remove some of the heaviness of a topic that like might actually be a barrier for folks. Like it feels too heavy to talk about, it's too scary. How can we make this like more approachable? So, you can make some memes connected to the topic that you're addressing and then have a slide with resources at the end. A lot of the memes I make are also like affirmations. So you don't have to go the like humorous route if that feels like a little too scary in terms of, addressing gender-based violence. Affirmations for survivors. And often I'll like put up a question box on my stories and ask folks like, what affirmations do you want to offer? Or do you wish you heard? And then I can crowdsource their responses and both share them in my stories, but also create memes using their responses. And in that way, I'm like building community. So, if you were to scroll back much deeper through my Instagram, you'd see that I didn't always make memes. I used to do these like mini essay posts where I shared information on a topic. And what I've really been noticing amongst other creators and those working in mental health is that they're shifting to either creating reels or memes, because that's actually just the kind of content that folks are like wanting to take in digitally. Because memes and reels also have the potential to go viral, they enable you to spread your message like really like far, around the globe. It's like I have people who follow me and who are in the Discord server who come to my webinars who are literally from all over the world, which is really cool. And it can connect you with other humans doing similar work who might be on similar healing journeys or like professionally. I've just made so many connections with folks for collaborations, and for work that I do in the world that have found me through making memes. And I'm just seeing a
Thank
question here from Rhonda, which I'll just quickly answer. Are affirmations effective? Is it important to engage in self-affirmations to help you in healing? Affirmations get a really bad rep, like, to be honest. I think we can see them as really cheesy, but the truth is they work. I have a whole series of affirmations for trauma survivors in one of the zines that I've made, and you'll get a link to my shop so you can check that out. But the zine in particular is called You Are Magic. And there's journaling prompts in there for folks as well.
Thank you, Margaret, for catching that. Okay, so on to the next question, please. This is the next one. Okay, Margot and Nicole, and you can go in any particular order. Our audience works in different contexts across diverse communities. What are some key takeaways or practices that you can integrate into their programming, that they, sorry, can integrate into their programming and projects to better support survivors? So I'm hoping people are grabbing their pens and paper ready to take those down.
Yeah, great. So, I think I've focused a lot in this conversation around, the takeaways. So here are some practices. I created a whole deck of cards that I've called Anchored, similar to kind of oracle cards or intuition cards, if you're familiar with those. And each card represents a different anchor that can support you with your healing. So this also comes with a 200-page guidebook. So each card comes with like a write-up that I've done about that card from a trauma-informed, politicized lens. And there's a practice for embodying each card. So I know for a fact that there are therapists, social workers, mental health professionals who have my deck in their sessions with clients. And so this can be a tool where you can like prompt the person that you're working with to pull a card at random or flip through the deck and select a card that speaks to them. Then you can either do the prompt together and, or, have the person you're working with do the prompt and share your reflections based off of what came up during the practice. And I started to create this deck specifically at a time in my life where chronic illness and dissociation had made it impossible for me to write. And so I turned to collage as a way to process when I couldn't. And I also run workshops where folks can create these cards themselves. And I can do that virtually or in person. So I'm happy to talk with folks about that. Another resource is that I have a coloring book of memes that I've made. Coloring is a great way to activate our vagus nerve, the part of us that brings us back into a state of feeling grounded, connected, present, because we're doing something creative here. So we're being creative and we're also doing something with our body by coloring. So there's 50 of my memes here offering different trauma-informed affirmations or like funny little, things that I've written. And these can also be used as access points for talking about hard subjects, available as a book or digital pages that you can print out, because I know shipping internationally for this is kind of prohibitively expensive from the US. And you can just have this, whether it's a workshop that you're facilitating, even when I'm doing workshops that aren't explicitly about trauma. In the past, before I had my own coloring book, I would print out some coloring pages that I really loved and have them on the table along with like pencil crayons and markers and different things so that folks could just like have something else to focus on if they just needed that as a support. So then some other tips. If you're running a program with a group, you can begin the session with a grounding practice, just like Nicole did with us. One of my favorites is to visualize your favorite place in nature and then move through the 5 senses. So this kind of looks like, what do you see in your favorite place? The ocean, different body of water, what animals or flowers are there? What do you hear? And continue to give examples throughout that practice. I also emphasize always that grounding practices are optional. Number one, giving survivors consent to know what works for them and what doesn't work for them is super important. Grounding can actually be really activating depending on where folks are at in their healing journey. And so yeah, I'm always just like, if this is not for you, you can, mute me for the next couple of minutes. I'll, respond in the chat when we're back, do anything that feels good for you. When closing out a program or session, I ask participants to select an affirmation card and then read theirs out to the group. I've linked one of my favorite ones here, which was made by queer and trans youth for Planned Parenthood. And they are also, you can also color them in. And then, my other tip is just really to remember that embodiment work has existed forever and that colonialism has severed so many communities from these ancient practices. And so I always just want us to uplift our embodied knowledge, because our body really does know things and we've just been so cut off from that knowledge. And we have layers of trauma, like an onion, that have covered over that intuitive knowledge, but it is there. And so always honoring and celebrating that when you're witnessing it.
Thank you so much, Magdal. And over to you, Nicole.
Over to me. Healing work is a systemic change. I mean, if there's any practices or takeaways or tips, I would start there. There's different ways that we can explore this. Again, it depends on which role I'm in. But peer support and group therapy, okay, very important. Again, I don't think we heal. I know this. We can't heal in isolation. We can't heal in the same way that our bodies were harmed and got sick, which means we were alone with overwhelming emotions and thus the nervous system got sick, which created symptoms in it. So our bodies are actually designed to heal in community. Okay. Our world here, we're in a Western world, so we kind of got westernized, but if we also explore a holistic approach, this also would make a lot more sense to most as well. Okay. Peer support, group therapy, it's a tool to reduce isolation and foster community resilience. Yep. Psychoeducation, education empowerment. Trauma disempowers us. It dissociates us out of our bodies. It's not safe to be in there, so we can't be in there. When it's overwhelming, we check out, we go somewhere else. The work really is any tool or tip that creates education empowerment to what's actually happening to our bodies. Psychoeducation, okay? Offer workshops, educational sessions that provide information about trauma. And I'll say that not everything works for all gender-based violence GBV clients or communities because the system wasn't created with lots of racialized communities in it. So it's very like it's not for us, some of it. So we have to really educate ourselves on what works, what happens to the brain when our bodies have not been discharged from a trauma response for centuries and centuries and centuries. May not work for someone who had developmental trauma. Okay, or an incident, a single event, or a series of events, because we're talking about a system that doesn't have an identity in it because of the ancestral trauma or whatever's coming down the line. Okay, yeah, psychoeducation. Okay, and also to say, healing work is a systemic change. Intimacy is the core of peace. Even being in this community today, not sure, but just sharing openly and authentically and educating on it and befriending. Margot, now I have a friend out there, like these types of things, okay? Intimacy is the core of peace. I live for it. People fear what they don't understand, and people attack what they fear. Intimacy is a curiosity with the intent to understand. When we bring that curiosity within ourselves, healing work is a systemic change. Right? When we bring that curiosity within ourselves and the world around us, we can create the foundation that peace can stand. And usually people will say, well, what is peace? Until that. So I'm like, maybe this group won't ask, so I'll ask the question. What is the definition of peace? It's an internal state of order and window of tolerance. Okay? It makes space for duality and for two people to exist. If I don't have window of tolerance in my body, I'm always in a reactivity. I can't exist with anyone because I'm too busy invisibly, unconsciously protecting myself all the time. But systemic work is a healing change as we begin to understand our roots of our reactivities and we begin to create this space. It does give this duality, and I live for this. Okay, so those are my tips. I know they're probably not
Thank
traditional.
you.
Okay, yeah.
Thank you, Nicole.
You're welcome.
I'm going to jump in now so that we can
Please.
have time for our Q&A. The good thing is that participants will have access to the slide deck and these resources and tips. So thank you, Nicole. Thank you, Margot. I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Margarita Perez, to guide us through our Q&A session. So thank you.
Thank you so much. And I'm happy to now join Nicole and Margot. I've been in the background, like really enjoying hearing you both speak. And I liked what those moments where you were vibing, as you said, Margot. I think that was really neat. There was some of that overlap. So I'm going to keep us on track and just remind everyone that we are going to be together until 2:30 Eastern time. So this now is the start of our Q&A. I'm going to do my best to go through. There were a lot of questions that we received from the audience. And so I'm going to now, we can start now with the Q&A portion and we'll go until 2:30 Eastern time. So One of the questions that we received is that, unfortunately, a lot of the work that I see in organizational change, including harassment prevention or DEI, for example, focuses on cognitive approaches, missing some key roots of issues. And this can only take culture change so far and not necessarily trauma responsive. However, since connecting to feelings and body is scary and it might be dismissed in a workplace, do you have any ways or experiences that you have followed to slowly ease folks who are very unfamiliar to these approaches, to help kind of ease and bring in this information into workspaces? So I'll open it up. I'm not sure if one of you would like to go first or if it resonates more with one than the other.
I feel like Nicole, you probably have much wisdom to share here.
Okay. Yes. So yes, when we're sharing healing work as a systemic change, this is what we're talking about here. Our bodies are viscerally in a protective response and a defensive response. So we do a lot of defending our inner world without knowing we're doing that. It is about offering trainings and more embodied or trauma training into workspace dynamics that are dealing with DEI. I feel so. Moving out of the cognitive approaches, anytime we're in our head, it becomes a them versus us. So we're always in the them versus us, which is not a connection. It's not a community that we're building. So if we can invite these types of training inside, or trauma responsive care training or embodiment care training that are attached to all the diversity, equity, and inclusion work, bodies can be less guarded. So we can explore whatever it comes into the space. It's a culture change because it's a systemic change where everybody's responsible for this fixing mode. Anytime we're in a community where there's a fixing, someone's in a defensive posture, what I call impact. So I gave the 6, like overprotecting, over-identifying, going stuck. So it is to, do embodiment training around that.
Thank you, Nicole. Thank you. I'm going to go on to one of the next questions that we received, which says, can you speak to anger as an emotion? I heard it referenced as repressed fear, but then there's also anger as an intelligent response to a violation of our autonomy or agency. So then is it in that case that it's not repressed fear, or do they fit together in some way? So this person would like some clarity around that.
Yeah, I mean, I know that this is in response to something Nicole shared, but I would be happy to jump in because it is a both and for sure. You know, one, we all have this fight part. You know, we talk about fight, flight, freeze, submit, attach, and you know, one of fight's key roles for us and why it's so important is that it lets us know when a boundary has been crossed, when our autonomy has been violated, when something unfair or unjust has happened. That's why, you know, our goal is actually not to get rid of any of these survival responses. Like, we need them. Without that fight response, we you know, I mean, I can speak to that as someone who spent my whole life repressing it, you know, and the effects that has had on my body. So remembering, for me as someone who has a lot of trauma around anger, I remember the work I had to do with my own somatic therapist around learning to feel anger in a way that wasn't going to activate me, because my understanding of anger was anger equals violence and equals abuse. And so, you know, she had asked me, she was like, what is can you think of a positive example of anger that you've seen? And the first thing that came to my mind was protest. Like, when we are out in the streets protesting injustice, that is anger showing up as this intelligent response. And, you know, there's also the ways in which anger is covering over fear, covering over grief. And that's a different shape that anger can take as a survival resource. And so I think for me, learning to differentiate between the two has really kind of looked like being able to tell just how regulated I am in my body, and accessing a kind of warm, regulated anger. So yeah, I'll pause there. I don't know. I'm seeing Nicole that you're typing an answer to this as well.
Yeah,
So
because I wanted to add to yours and just, which I did, so I'll just send it there.
great.
Thanks, Nicole. Did you want to speak to it, or you added it in the chat?
I did because I didn't want,
Okay.
okay, but I can't, if Margot want, yeah, no, I was
That's
just
fine.
putting in the chat that anger is repressed sadness from a psychodynamic perspective. And it tends to get mischaracterized with rage. So for people who witnessed rage in their household, growing up or however it was, they may feel when we're doing anger work or they're connecting to their anger that it's rage, and they're two polar opposites. Okay, rage is a projection, it's not contained. It says, I want you to feel what I feel, and the person's unconscious of it. You can't wake them up from that with deeper work, of course, but anger is not. It's repressed sadness. What's scaring you right now? What's making you sad? It's the body's way, exactly like, that's why I didn't want to interrupt. Margaret was saying, it's saying, I can't let you do that. It tells you when your body can have a boundary, when a body was taught not to exist or not have a boundary, or that the body belonged to someone else, okay, in essence. So that's what I was typing.
Thank you, Nicole. Thank you, Margot. Thank you both. I'm going to move on to another question that we received in the Q&A that says, how does the Black body of culture heal from trauma when there's daily trauma via the racist institutions, systems, policies, practices, procedures, and laws? Also, there's an inaccurate term with the first word of PTSD, meaning post. Post means past. Post-PTSD is not true for Black, Indigenous, and other folks who experience PTSD daily. So allowing both of you to respond.
Mm-hmm. It is so important. So we're talking about systemic trauma. It's present in every day, in day to day, because it's etched into the system that we're in, which can reenact and recreate daily trauma, like being re-traumatized. One of the things is very imperative to healing work is to find safer spaces, safer communities, so that the nervous system can breathe and heal. If our bodies stay trapped, re-traumatized or vicarious trauma, also the nervous system can't really heal because it can't really take a break. We also stay fixed in a trauma response. And so even though, for example, my body has a hyper independence to this day in this busyness, and if I don't literally pick my body up and take it out of the environment or work, I will stay busy in a response because it's resistant. It's staying to ensure my safety in the busyness or the hyper independence. So I have a daily commitment to my body to do that, working with systems and in a system. So to simply answer that, it is imperative to find safer people to release in whatever way. If you're in Black communities, we love twerking, dancing, eating, singing, like just, because our bodies back into its own descent. Indigenous may have similar, you can speak for your own, where we have to celebrate it out of the body. And that even got objectified. We can't twerk, we can't move like that, where that was where we emotionally released and reconnected with our ancestors. So safer communities, safer people, and a daily commitment to picking your body up and taking it out of environment so your nervous system can rest.
Thank you, Nicole. Thank you.
Welcome.
I also wanted to, so I am as aware of the time, but I believe we still have an opportunity here where we could do about 2 more questions. There was actually a question that was posed to Margot as well that's asking here about the emphasis on humor, which is healing, and wonder if some have resisted this. I have seen a lot of overly technical approaches to trauma.
Yeah, I mean, I also kind of love the technical too. So I think it can be a both and like yes, there has been, resistance to what some have called like the memification of like trauma and the memification of therapy. And I get why that exists as a critique, because of course, I cannot capture all of the nuances of like trauma and healing in one slide deck of memes. You know, and that would be impossible. And even when I created my little mini essay post before I started making memes, I still couldn't capture it. You know, that's why I have a whole PhD dissertation that I wrote, you know, and even that there's more that I could say. So I get that critique. And I also feel like again and again as an educator, I'm just like, how do we make knowledge accessible? That is just core for me. And, you know, bringing in that piece that Nicole said around like so much of healing is about play, like being able to access play, pleasure, you know, like it's just so crucial. So being able to like actually laugh while, you know, I sort of joke that my memes are kind of like if there was like, you know, an emoji for it, it's like the LOL sob, like we're like laughing and crying like simultaneously because there's like a feeling scene, but there's also like a oof, like I'm feeling this, I'm like resonating with this. But also again, you know, I in my captions, I tend to, you know, have a lot more of like the technical information, or I flag to my webinars, or there is stuff where like I get into the nitty-gritty of neuroscience because I think it's cool and I like to talk about it. But yeah, you know, I think that there's just so many different ways to approach this work. And there are going to be people who are resistant to the ways that I approach it. And that's fine if that's like not like for them. And, you know, at this point, with like the number of followers that I do have, like I feel like there's a reason why my account is really popular. And that's because it is like helping people and because, you know, the technical knowledge can actually be very inaccessible.
Thank you, Margot. Thank you, Nicole. And I really wish, Nicole, Margot, I wish we had more time. We're now at the end of our webinar. I just want to say a few words here as we close up. Thank you so much for today, for your insightful, your presentation, the way that you brought it together and were able to collaborate today. We really appreciate your time and expertise. I also just want to thank the ASL interpreters that are joining us today. We have Rogue Benjamin and Jamie Chung Wong, and also our French language interpreters, Carolyn Napier and Carolyn Schutz. And we just want to remind folks that there's going to be an evaluation that you'll receive. So please don't forget to complete the evaluation form to receive a certificate of participation, and a link will automatically open in your browser after the webinar has ended. Thank you again to our speakers. I think you might be seeing in the chat all of the appreciation. We look forward to seeing all of you next time at our next webinar. Thank you so much.